Hey everybody. So today a big piece came out on Tulsi Gabbard in New York Magazine. And whenever a big piece comes out on Tulsi Gabbard, you kind of have to assume it's going to be overwhelmingly negative. And while there were some details in this piece that you could reasonably describe as unflattering, on a whole, I think it actually did a really good job of parsing some of the complicated issues associated with Tulsi's biography. So I don't view it as a smear piece. I see it as a good faith attempt on the part of the author to honestly engage with some pretty, thorny issues around Tulsi's atypical upbringing. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. If you're a presidential candidate, you have to expect that your entire life is going to be scrutinized, including your childhood. And as long as it's done in a manner that's not overly and harshly and superficially judgmental, I think it's fair game. And the author is Carrie Howley, who I've known of for years. I don't know her personally all that well, but online I've known her for a very long time. She's just a phenomenal writer. She's extremely perceptive and empathetic. She wrote a very good book that was published in 2014 called Throne, which was basically an exploration of the absurdities of mixed martial arts fighting. And she's an essayist. She's written her I think her most recent piece prior to this one, or one piece that she did recently from last fall that was really good, was on Larry Nassar and how the culture at the University of Michigan led to a situation where Larry Nassar apparently could, molest so many young girls. And I'm just making sure that Larry Nassar is from the University of Michigan because I don't want to screw that up. Oh, I'm sorry, Michigan State University, not University of Michigan. Anyway, but Carrie Howley, she wrote I think a definitive piece on that scandal. She wrote a profile on Reality Winner, which I thought was largely very good in terms of being a character profile. And so she did one on Tulsi, and I think, if the issues around Tulsi's upbringing are going to be discussed by anybody, better it be Carrie Howley than your typical media hack, because Carrie Howley actually has the acuity to discuss these issues in a way that isn't reductive or necessarily aimed toward smearing her or discrediting her. Okay. Carrie Howley also is not like a typical screeching liberal. I believe she's a left libertarian. That's basically how I came to know her first, through her affiliation with Reason Magazine years ago. So she's not somebody who's going to be politically inclined to just, tarnish Tulsi willy-nilly. So what are some issues brought up in the piece? Well, obviously I'll link to it, and you can read it for yourself if you like. But it starts off with what I think is actually a reasonably accurate distillation of Tulsi's personality, which is that she's sort of an introvert who has been thrust into a situation where it is required of her to be extroverted. And that kind of comes through in her style. I mean, I think Tulsi is very personable and relatable, but you do kind of gather from interacting with her and seeing her in public that it's not necessarily her most natural instinct to be engaging in public with strangers. It's not like an organic extension of her kind of inborn personality. And Howley gives an anecdote from Tulsi's childhood where, like, her sister would be kind of her spokesperson whereas Tulsi was like the well-behaved and well-disciplined sibling. And I know I think that sort of rings true about her. Again, a psychological profile of somebody can be very bad if it's done poorly. But I think here, Carrie Howley does it with the best possible intentions. Um, and even Carrie Howley herself says that she shares these same personality traits with Tulsi, so she actually finds her relatable. Here's a line from Howley that I think is also roughly accurate. In interview after interview, Tulsi gives the impression of having anti-establishment convictions just beyond the reach of articulation, as if she had carried instructions into battle and lost them. Her speeches feel not so much overly prepared as capably delivered from a separate location through her. She operates on the slightest delay, taking in information, scanning it, and delivering a slow response that registers only barely on her face. Now, that might seem negative, but I actually think there's something laudable and admirable in that Tulsi doesn't have a natural disposition where she's going to be very animated and excitable, right? But nonetheless, she's used her idiosyncratic personal style to convey a message that is genuinely, quote, disruptive. And one thing that I lightly disagree with Howley on, at least in terms of the characterization, is where she says, quote, "There is no cohesive ideology that explains the idiosyncratic political positioning, no single point of reference from which it all makes sense. And so the relevant question regarding Tulsi Gabbard is reducible to, what is she doing?" Okay, so number one, it's true that Tulsi has some idiosyncratic political positions, and her trajectory politically is not reducible to political calculation. So you can't understand what she has done over the course of her career by reference to raw, naked political calculation, because it wouldn't make sense for her to have, for example, endorsed Bernie Sanders at a very inopportune time in the 2016 election cycle if Tulsi Gabbard was simply looking out for her own political interests, because that cut her off to large segments of the Democratic Party. It wouldn't have been a politically advantageous thing for her to go to Syria in 2017 and meet with Bashar al-Assad, because now that's going to be something that for the rest of her life is associated with her and used by her critics to malign her. If she was interested purely in opportunism, she would have, stayed quiet, staked out some, mainstream Democratic positions, and allowed herself to rise through the hierarchy in the party, which she was kind of doing prior to 2016, having been given this vice chairmanship in the Democratic National Committee. She probably could have ran for Senate at some point, but she went to a different course, and I think it is true that you can't necessarily attribute that to any typically recognizable political calculation. But that doesn't mean that necessarily that she has no cohesive ideology. I think you have to. I think there is a way in which you can discern various aspects of her political persona in a way that is cohesive. Okay? But it just takes some extra effort because she transcends typical partisan boundaries, and she doesn't have the same priors, or she doesn't operate from the same baseline philosophical precepts as mainline liberals or even leftists, even if she often does arrive at the same policy prescriptions as liberals and leftists. And she also, on top of that, has, I think, a certain kind of conservative temperamental disposition, which, when coupled with the policy agenda, causes some confusion about where she's coming from. But even if it confuses some, it also intrigues others. So the idiosyncrasy is kind of central to her appeal. So I think this piece, by elucidating the reasons for her idiosyncrasy, actually bolsters her in a way and increases the level of intrigue that she's bound to elicit, even if for others it is perceived as negative. The piece discusses her upbringing, and the headline, I'm sure if you're a Tulsi fan, might rub you the wrong way, because the headline is something to the effect of, what was it? Let me actually pull it up here because, again, don't want to misquote anything. Let's see. Tulsi Gabbard had a very strange childhood. That's the headline. Okay. She did have a strange childhood in the sense that it's not typical of the generic American childhood, okay? It doesn't mean it's a bad childhood or it's necessarily inherently suspicious. It just means that it's atypical. Obama had an atypical childhood. I mean, Trump had an atypical childhood. A lot of people who rise to levels of political prominence had an atypical childhood. But Tulsi has extra layers of atypicalness because she's from Hawaii. She's Polynesian, and she grew up in a household that religiously is not within the mainstream of American life. Again, that's not a bad thing. It's just a truth about her. And in fact, I think it actually bolsters the case for her in a way, because her, quote, strange upbringing imbued her with a set of experiences that have enabled her to forge a genuinely independent political trajectory and life trajectory that has allowed her to resist mainstream consensus opinion and cut against the grain, even where it might not seem the most opportunistic or advantageous thing for her to do. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having a strange upbringing. Maybe you might use a different word than strange. You might say anomalous or atypical. But nonetheless, I almost think it's good to be strange in that way. I mean, what is strange per the dictates of conventional American political opinion? Yeah, belonging to a Hare Krishna sect is probably strange. Not bad, but strange. Only in the sense that most Americans cannot relate to that experience, right? But most people around the world find it strange to view a ancient Galilean as the savior of humanity because he allegedly rose from the dead 2,000 years ago and will return to rule over Earth. I mean, those are a series of strange claims for people who don't subscribe to Christianity. So that could just as easily be depicted as strange. I think Hare Krishna is like something that you can relate to even if you're atheistic. I mean, it's kind of like Buddhism in a way because, yeah, it makes appeals to the divine and to God, but it's kind of pluralistic in that you can engage with it on a secular level, whereas for many manifestations of Christianity and other monotheistic religions, you can't really do that. So I don't have a problem with that. And here's the thing with this profile. Ultimately, I think Howley reaches positive conclusions about Tulsi. Again, even if some of the details she unearths or amplifies are at least superficially unflattering. So Howley questions, what is the nature of us having a tolerance for diversity, religious or otherwise? I mean, she points out that Joe Biden, the current frontrunner, signed on to the program launched by George W. Bush to wage war worldwide after 9/11, which is still going strong. Why isn't that strange? Her critics in the think tank world, I mean, Howley does, quotes an unnamed expert, quote unquote, at a prominent think tank to, quote, to think publicly about foreign affairs. She's kind of saying that sarcastically. Sent Howley, this unnamed think tank expert sent Howley a 2-line email asserting that Tulsi is unqualified to lead and refused to elaborate. So in this article, Howley actually is scornful of the quote foreign policy blob or the people in the establishment or mainstream who are instinctively hostile to Tulsi for reasons they can't seem to quite articulate. She just provokes a kind of fury for reasons that aren't necessarily well formed or logical amongst a lot of people, which again also creates intrigue about her, and which is why I think she's gaining some traction, at least incrementally. You know, not that she's anywhere close to being a front runner or anything like that, but she is gradually developing some semblance of a base of support. And Howley even mentions the really embarrassing exchange that Barry Weiss had with Joe Rogan a couple months ago, where Barry Weiss famously accuses Tulsi of being a toady for Assad, and then Barry Weiss could like hardly even explain what the hell she meant by that, which was emblematic of this kind of vague animus that many people in establishment precincts have for Tulsi, and that animus doesn't tend to be rooted in anything that's like coherent or logical. So I think again, if the somewhat atypical aspects of Tulsi's upbringing are going to be discussed and elucidated by anyone, better it be somebody like Carrie Howley, who's at least a talented and perceptive writer. I don't think, if you're a Tulsi supporter, I don't think it's correct to automatically dismiss every examination of her background as a quote smear. People have a right to scrutinize the backgrounds of presidential candidates, and I don't see a whole lot that was wrong with this piece, even if I might quibble with aspects of it. I think on a whole, it was actually fair, and again, reached some positive conclusions about her, because it kind of cast her as a admirably independent voice by virtue of her unusual background. So that was my takeaway. Let me know what you think. Again, I'll link to the piece here, and I'll talk to you later.